The mass shootings that occurred over the weekend in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, have dominated headlines this week. The nation continues to mourn the victims of these senseless attacks. But we've also seen the politicization of these events, even by members of the Catholic hierarchy. Also, the Catholic world was shaken last week when it was announced that the John Paul II Institute on Marriage and Family, an institution dedicated to the thought of the late sainted Pope, was being refounded. But why? And what does it mean? Joining me with analysis of all of this is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Arroyo, who joins me in studio, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD Murray, who joins us from Massachusetts. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I want to start with the horrific violence we saw last weekend in Texas and Ohio. Understandably, look, nerves and patience, I think, are wearing thin for these kinds of attacks. Bishop Garcia Siller of San Antonio, Texas, tweeted this following the shootings. He said, "President, stop hate and racism, starting with yourself." He later deleted the tweet and apologized for going after the president personally, but afterward posted several Facebook messages regarding hateful rhetoric and gun control. Are the bishops exceeding their competency, particularly with these kinds of personal attacks? Robert Royal.
Well, look, you rightly say that everybody's emotions are on edge, and this has happened far too frequently lately in the United States. But the question is, what can we do about these things? And I wish I had an answer for this. I wish the bishops had, I wish somebody had an answer for this. But one thing I'm quite certain about is that accusing people of racism or further inflaming the divisions that already exist among us, I don't think is going to help. Now, look, we know that Donald Trump is not perfect. He could have said some things differently than he said, tweets or remarks that he made. But I think we're getting to the point where to call whole swaths of the society people who are promoting racism or promoting white nationalism or white supremacy has gone way, way out of bounds. And I think the bishops in particular could serve a calming role if they were to enter in with a different kind of language. So I hope we begin to see more of that. It's good that the bishop pulled back a little bit. The bishops have been notoriously open, virtually to open borders down along our southern border. But I think that maybe this will urge us to move in some different directions. At least we can hope as much.
Father Jerry, there is a confluence here of immigration, which is a big issue for the bishops, not only because they're concerned about the humanity of these people, the well-being of refugees seeking shelter, but also because, look, the USCCB, a big part of its mission is to resettle refugees. They get a huge federal grant each year to do so. So that is a core of the mission. But I want your thoughts on just what Bob was talking about. We are at such a toxic level of rhetoric now. Might there be a role for the bishops and all clergy particularly, not only to calm, but to bring us together and to help us find our way through this moment of tragedy?
There certainly is, Raymond. I think the primary focus has to be a call to reconversion in this nation back to God and to His law. You know, what we're seeing here is diabolical violence perpetrated by hateful men who are filled with bad ideas, who hate their neighbor, indiscriminate killing. This is part of a pattern of the demoralization of our society. You know, one thing I reflect upon is the ease with which people go from the computer game murder of people, you know, for gaming purposes, and then they go out and do this sort of thing. I don't know the personal history of these two men, but I certainly know that there's a desensitization in our entertainment industry to the idea of taking lives. That has to end. And likewise, our bishops have to lead the way in reminding us the only answer to evil in society is to reaffirm God's law and our adherence to it. That's what we really need.
Well, I totally agree with you. You know, there's a movie out later in September called The Hunt, and it is literally about liberal elites who go out to a hunting ground and they shoot Trump supporters, MAGA supporters, supposedly. Universal is releasing this film. That's just a little bit of the, I think, fantasia, violent fantasia that we see playing out on television, in films, and in these horrible, vicious video games. All of that does play a role, but I want to focus for the moment on the bishops. Bishop Siller Garcia's statement I was struck by because it seems to me if you truly believe that the leader of a nation has racist sensibilities or is himself a racist, isn't it incumbent upon you as a leader and a follower of Jesus Christ to go out to that soul and try to engage and convert that individual? Or are some souls simply not worth saving?
Well, yeah, look, first of all, we know that Donald Trump is not a warm, fuzzy type person.
Yeah, no,
he gets attacked, he's a counterpuncher.
He's a blunt and can be an attack dog at times.
But look, there are 300 million guns in the United States. We know about this. Every time we see something like this, we want to do something about the existence
Control
of guns.
the guns, yeah.
And, you know, there may be some ways that there can be some progress made along those lines. But the sheer fact of the matter, as Father was saying, is that there's a breakdown of morale. The people who study this, the psychologists and the sociologists, will tell you that it's mostly white young men. It's mostly men. I think one study I saw had 27 of the last 28 shooters were men who did not have a father in the house. So the roots of this go back to a breakdown in the family, I mean, in a very concrete way. This is not Catholic morality being talked about in an abstraction. The lack of a male presence that teaches a young man how to control his emotions and not to just give in to
Lash
anger.
out. Yeah.
You know, that is roughly where we're at. Now, look, there are other things that happen in the country. Someone had just pointed out that in Chicago last weekend, there were 55 shootings, one of 7 and one of 8, which are never even reported.
No.
You know, this is another example of the kind of thing that is happening in the country. This is a big country. There are 350 million people in the country, and so there are going to be loose nuts and bolts as well as you know, common criminality. But I think we have to look back, and I wish our religious and moral leaders would talk about how this remoralization has to take place. It is not simply a matter of political points of view or this or that gun control measure. It's a matter of a moral refoundation of the country.
Well, I agree. And Father, I want your reaction to this. The bishops released a statement on August 3rd. They said the plague that gun violence has become continues unchecked and spreads across the country. Things must change. Once again, we call for effective legislation that addresses why these unimaginable and repeated occurrences of murderous gun violence continues to take place in our communities. Then they went on, they revised the statement later, and they said this a day later. We call on all relevant committees of the U.S. Bishops' Conference to outline a reinvigorated policy agenda and pastoral campaign to address ways we can help fight the social disease that has infected our nation. The conference has long advocated for responsible gun laws and increased resources for addressing the root causes of violence. We also call upon the President and Congress to set aside political interests and find ways to better protect innocent life. Your reaction to that statement, Father?
Well, there's a lot going on in that statement, and certainly, you know, legislative means are necessary when you have criminality spreading throughout the country. But I think the important message, what I said earlier, we have to convince the people in our society that to live like savages, where violence is the way you take out your emotional dissatisfaction, is wrong, and it's not going to be tolerated. On the flip side of that, we have to have vigorous support for our police and their efforts to suppress criminality in our society. You know, one of the things that annoys me most about critics of the policing policies in the United States is that they focus on a few bad incidents and then basically the police become suspect. Thank God in both of these incidents, particularly the one in Dayton, the police got there to stop this guy, these guys who did this. But you know, the United States of America is not a country where people decide for themselves what's right or wrong. We have laws, we have morality, most people believe in God. We have to remind, if you believe in God, you believe in His law, and you teach your children to follow it, and when they don't follow it, you punish them. This is the kind of thing we need to reinvigorate in our society.
Well, and when you study, as I have this week, Father, the connection between mental health trauma, isolation, fatherlessness, isolation from family and community, these are the things that usually lead and what the common traits we see in these mass shooters. I've called for a presidential task force or commission to study the connection between the mental health issues and the isolation and this terrible violence. And I think we all need to focus on that. And it seems to me members of the faith community, whether they be Catholic or other faiths, really need to take a look at the people around us in our community and try to identify those marginalized young men largely who are pushed aside, forgotten. We worry about the other. We worry about welcoming the stranger. There's a stranger in our midst that too often goes unregarded and ignored, and that becomes the epicenter of this violence. It's where its fountainhead springs from. And I do think we need to look at that in some way if we're ever going to address this epidemic.
Raymond, you're absolutely right. And, you know, how often in our society do we have this kind of attitude that people have problems, leave them alone. We're not going to get involved. That doesn't work. When you have a society in which mentally ill people are allowed to sleep on sidewalks, use drugs, commit petty crimes, and then the public authorities do nothing, you're encouraging precisely this kind of wayward behavior. We need accountability, and we need a communitarian sense, which is very important, that in the society we don't allow deviant behavior to go unattended, unpunished, or untreated. We find out what's the cause and we do something.
Yeah, bravo. I agree. I agree. I want to move on to a very important story that has amazingly gotten little attention. The John Paul II Institute has been refounded. Now, this is the Institute on Marriage and Family, and it's been refounded with two well-known professors sacked. Now, first, what is the rationale, Robert Royal, for refounding the John Paul II Institute? Why does it need a refounding?
Well, this is quite odd because in 2017, the Holy Father published a document, Suprema Familia Cura, in which he said the previous John Paul II Institute had all this wonderful, almost 20 years of existence, but now it has ceased to exist. Viene a cessare. I actually looked up the Italian of this. And we kind of noticed that that was the case, and that what they wanted to do was include the social sciences in the study of family and marriage and other things. Now, you know, on the face of it, this doesn't sound so awful, but as I wrote in a column this week, we've seen this addition of social sciences in the past.
Yeah, what does that mean?
We saw this in the run-up to the Family Synod and in the Synod on Youth, and now the Amazon Synod, the same thing. And usually what it means, I hope I'm wrong about this, but usually what it means is a prelude to kind of moving away to more heterodox views about whatever the thing happens to be under study. So in this case, the term social science was added to the name of John Paul II Institute on Family and Marriage. And the president, the previous president, Monsignor Livio Melina, the previous president, he was told that his position in moral theology was being eliminated, and therefore there was no longer any need for him at the Institute. So this is a very funny thing. You know, people often talk about how personnel is policy.
Right.
When you get rid of the top echelon of the leadership of the Institute, and then also tell all the faculty members that they've been suspended because now it's a new institution. This is quite a radical change in terms of personnel. So does this presage some change of direction? I would be very surprised if it doesn't. I deeply hope that I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that what we're going to see happen now to the John Paul II Institute, which has been a wonderful teaching institution around the world, not only in Rome, here in Washington and many other countries as well, this wonderful institution that has fought back for marriage and for family may very well now turn out to be quite similar to many other institutions that get
Sounds
rather
like the Pontifical
compromised.
Council of Life. Remember the Academy of Life, which was also reformed, and they basically showed everybody the door, and it broadened its meaning to become meaningless. I mean, it's no longer, you know, life and youth, abortion and euthanasia focused on that. It's now broadened to include basically everything, so it includes nothing.
The students, this is very interesting, 250 students signed a letter, sent it to the new leadership of the institution and said, look, we're not against adding social sciences to the theology and philosophy and other things we've done in the past. I think a little bit naively, because I think we know social science, as I've joked that we got scientific socialism and we got scientific racism and scientific psychology in the past that led to disasters in the 20th century. But they were actually even willing sort of generously to allow the program to be expanded, but what in fact has happened is they've dropped out the key, which is the moral theology and the Catholic difference that we have in the perspective on the person and on family.
Father, as Bob was just saying, Monsignor Livio Melina, who's the moral theologian at the JP2 Institute, he was fired. He met with Pope Benedict this week. What is the significance of that meeting, and do you see this as a purge?
Quite frankly, Raymond, I do see this as a revolution and a purge. I think Archbishop Paglia wants to get rid of the former academic program. They do not want to focus on Catholic morality as understood in continuity with the traditional morality taught by St. Thomas Aquinas and others. They're going to basically substitute a sociological approach to looking at the family. I think that's a waste of time. That's done in secular universities and to greater or lesser degrees. The Catholic difference, as Bob says, is to teach revelation in the light of sound philosophy. The elimination of the position of Monsignor Molina so that he no longer has a job, I think, is a cynical act. You do not have a Catholic moral program without a fundamental Catholic moral theology course. And I was very glad that former Pope Benedict, Pope Emeritus, received him because they're close friends. They've worked together very well. And I think he was expressing, you know, his human and Christian sympathy to a man who has, quite frankly, been offended. Archbishop Pallia's program here is not what John Paul II intended when he founded that institution, and I regret it very much that this is happening.
Yeah, well, Father Jose Noriega, who taught moral theology at the Institute, offered a number of specialized courses. He was also fired. So my question, Bob, what is Pope Francis's vision for this institute? Why are we seeing these sweeping changes there? What was the danger of the John Paul II Institute on Marriage and Family or challenge, rather, to the current prevailing thinking on marriage and family in the Vatican?
Well, we know from Monsignor Molina, when he came out of his meeting with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, that he made a statement saying that if what they are saying is what we did in the past is not adequate, that in effect what they're saying is that it's no longer tolerable for the Church to teach that traditional view of Catholic morals in terms of sexuality, marriage, etc. So that's already quite a profound thing that happened. I think it's quite curious that other than people like us and people at the Catholic thing and a very few other outlets, this has not even been noticed by Catholic outlets like the Jesuit publication America, Commonweal, the National Catholic Reporter. It's as if it doesn't exist. They're very concerned about lots of other issues in the Church and in the world. But we know Our Lady of Fatima said that the final battle between the Church and the world is going to be over marriage and the family. And I take Fatima very seriously. I think Fatima explains the last 100 and some odd years. And something very strange is happening here.
Yeah.
Again, you could add these sciences, although I agree with Father that quite often these things are bogus. And it's already, that sort of thing is already being done at secular universities and at, sadly to say, many Catholic universities, where there is not a big following of John Paul II or Benedict XVI.
No, and let's face it, this here in Washington and in Rome, the John Paul II Institute was an engine, a factory of Orthodox theologians and teachers that then disseminated throughout the world and continued this traditional vision for marriage and family, taking into account John Paul II's revolutionary Humanae Vitae, the Familias Consortio, the vision of the human person, and the theology of the body, all of which one wonders where that stands today. Now, John Allen, Father Murray, did an interview with one of the new appointees at this John Paul II Institute, and he told John Allen that they have a mandate from Pope Francis to continue the tradition as it was. Do you buy that? Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, we certainly don't see that if you fire and abolish the Department of Fundamental Moral Theology. I took Fundamental Moral Theology in the seminary, and it was an eye-opener because it taught me precisely the bases for how the Catholic Church teaches what's different between right and wrong. So if you eliminate that, you're really hobbling yourself. It's interesting to note that during the two synods on the family, no one from the John Paul II Institute was invited as an expert witness. And I don't think that was unintentional. We have to face the facts that Amoris Laetitia proposed a different way of understanding human acts, sinfulness, responsibility than what had been taught previously. And the fight in the Catholic Church right now is to try to vindicate the traditional teaching of the Church that God in no way permits sin to accomplish a so-called higher good. Sin is never permitted. And also Catholic moral theology has a very clear way of how you define what is sinful. When we substitute different categories and come up with fundamental option, you know, people, greater good gets done, this and that, all kinds of ways that people try to get around it. But in the end, the Catholic Church teaches certain acts are intrinsically immoral, may never be done, and can never be converted into a good. If we go away from that teaching, and I'm afraid that's what might be happening here, then we are entering a disaster of major proportions, which is going to disorient the church at large.
Wow. No, Bob, as you commented earlier, it's amazing the lack of coverage, but to me, it's a canary in the coal mine. This is telling us something about the direction of this, what is at the heart of Catholicism. It is the theology. It is what we teach and believe. And when you alter that, you alter everything. How important is Amoris Laetitia as the guiding force of what we're seeing here? Is that what it's all about?
I think it's fundamental. There are some people who are arguing that the issue at stake was the interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, and that the JP2 Institute, as it was earlier founded by the Pope, by Pope John Paul II, was attempting to interpret Amoris Laetitia in light of the tradition. In other words, in continuity, these ambiguities that exist, as we've talked about many times.
And tell people very quickly who may not be aware, Amoris Laetitia was the recent teaching of Pope Francis coming out of those two family synods that insisted what?
Well, the ambiguity, they say it's a small ambiguity, but it's quite clear that what they're trying to do is to make it possible for people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment to receive communion. You know, not only to go to confession, but to receive communion. Now, this is a major change. And this is what's sometimes been called a Casper option. Yeah. And if it is true that what the major intention here is to make sure that Amoris Laetitia is now interpreted in a different direction, I think we can see that there's a clear kind of watershed there. Just one other point. It's been said, and I think that this is quite valid, that another target here is Veritatis Splendor, which was the 1994 encyclical by Pope John Paul II that affirmed that there are absolute truths that we can know, that it's not just all a matter of negotiation and kind of situational ethics, that there are certain things
and what people say,
that have been revealed to us by God, that we can appropriate rationally and understand ourselves, that are standing principles that we must abide by if we're going to be Catholic. I mean, I would just say that otherwise, what is the revelation? If we don't have sure revelations about faith and morals, then we can pretty much make up things the way we want to, and we fall into a kind of a radical Protestantism. So there's a lot going on here, and this is going to be something that I think we're going to have to keep our eyes on going forward, because we're going to see now, are some of those suspended professors allowed to come back to teach? Are we going to see what direction this is going to move in? And I think it'll become apparent very quickly whether there's a continuity and a deepening, as the new leadership has said, or whether there is a departure into something different.
Well, as so many of these things, you know, you have things that are founded with a certain vision. And as Mother Angelica used to say, if God doesn't bless the thing and it's not fulfilling his purposes in the church, it will turn to dust. It will wither away. And we'll see what happens. Now, there's a story out of Cincinnati. Father Murray, I want your reaction to this. An auxiliary bishop, Joseph Binzer, who's a member of the USCCB's Child Protection Committee, is being removed as head of the priest personnel office there in Cincinnati. He failed, apparently, to tell the Archbishop about allegations of sexual abuse against a priest. Later, when another charge was lodged against that same priest, the diocese dismissed it as an isolated incident due to the failure to report the initial charges. Now, how big a problem is this? And should this bishop even remain a bishop, given Pope Francis's new protocols?
This is a very grave situation, Raymond, because the auxiliary bishop there was negligent in not reporting to his archbishop the allegations of canonical crimes regarding sexual abuse of minors. He didn't tell the archbishop that this priest had been accused, and then reassigned him to a new parish. Now, when the information became available publicly in another way, the archbishop is furious. I note that the auxiliary bishop's behavior falls under now the new sanction in the new canon law that was promulgated by Pope Francis back in May, which involves covering up criminal behavior by the clergy. So I fully expect that the Archbishop is going to refer this matter directly to the Holy See. And we have to treat this seriously. Not only is it horrible when a priest commits these crimes, when those responsible for supervising them cover up this matter and thereby make it possible for that priest to commit further crimes, we are in a situation of grave danger to the Church. That's why the Holy See issued the new law, and it's imperative that the Holy See act. Now, in that new law, it's required that there be a quick response once the Holy See has been notified. I expect that's what's going to happen, because Archbishop Schnurr, according to the reports, was absolutely furious, and I agree with him.
Well,
the only response to this negligence has to be punishment.
Father and Bob, there is a complicating factor here in that Bishop Binzer, the auxiliary we're talking about, he did report these allegations of abuse to law enforcement and to the Archdiocesan Victims Assistance Coordinator. Law enforcement found no criminal activity. Does that let him off the hook? Robert Royal.
Look, I would say no. I would say that one of the things that may be good that comes out of this circumstance is that we're going to change the vector of what happens in the Church. In the past, we know that the tendency has been to protect the institution, to try to make things go away, keep things quiet. I think that the vector now has to be in the opposite direction. That you know, not wild charges against people. We want to make sure that there are credible reasons why punishments are going to be imposed.
But transparent.
But I think if a bishop were removed for failure to report a case of abuse, this would send a very strong message to everybody that instead of protecting the institution as in the past, the surest way to get yourself into hot water is to cover up something that ought to be reported, certainly to your superior. If you're going to report to the police and you're going to report to some committee of oversight committee, your archbishop should know about what you're doing. So in a kind of paradoxical way, maybe something good will come out of this.
Father Jerry, I need your reaction to this. The Washington Post is questioning the findings, this concerns another bishop, of the Michael Bransfield probe. Now, this is the former bishop of Wheeling, West Virginia. Now, the Washington Post is questioning findings in that probe of Bishop Bransfield, the former bishop, I should say. When the report came down, the report by the Church, it said they could find no conclusive evidence of sexual misconduct with minors. But the Post said that apparently the investigation of some of these allegations were stymied by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, where the abuse allegedly occurred, because they thought they didn't have the jurisdiction over a sitting bishop in another diocese, Bransfield. The Post writes, quote, "All of this suggests that the new system of bishops investigating bishops is simply a new face of the Church's textbook protectionism," end quote. Are they wrong?
Well, they're wrong in the sense that the bishops' measures that were just voted on in June are brand new, whereas these two allegations go back a number of years. Now, what is disturbing is that Archbishop Lurray's report did not even footnote these allegations, and in particular the second one, that Bransfield had committed some act of sexual molestation of a youth while he was a high school teacher in the early 2000s. And yes, the Philadelphia diocese did not feel that it was their responsibility to investigate, which is again a case of negligence. In fact, this goes back to the very unfortunate history of Cardinal Regali's relationship with his own review board, where it is a known fact that he refused to act on a number of the recommendations for removal of clergy that came down as regards priests in his diocese, and that those priests were only later removed when the civil authority came in and publicized this fact. So the long and the short of it is, Archbishop Lurray, I think, would do a big favor to himself and to all of us if he addressed clearly why these two cases were not dealt with in its report on Bransfield. And then, quite frankly, the Holy See should be informed formally, and everyone known that they're informed, that a reinvestigation of that charge from the early 2000s should take place, because a technicality leading to, well, I don't know, I'm not responsible for investigating, that's no way to handle someone who in fact may have committed a grave canonical crime of abusing a minor, even when he was as a priest, now a bishop.
I agree. Okay. I want to move on to an important survey before we run out of time. The Pew Foundation discovered that 7 in 10 Catholics, 69%, believe the consecrated bread and wine at Mass are merely symbols of the body and blood of Christ. Only 1/3 believe it to be the actual body and blood of Jesus as taught by Catholic teaching. I was not at all surprised by this, Bob, were you?
Not in the least. I mean, look, the Catholics who go to Mass on a regular basis, the percentage is much higher, although still
Not really.
but still worrisome.
Yeah.
Among people who are regular Mass goers. Look, we're living in a Protestant culture in which concrete sacramental sources of grace are not taken very seriously to begin with. But then there's the other element, that what has Catholic teaching over the last 50, 60 years, since, especially since Vatican II, done? I mean, there was a whole way in which it was conveyed, even if it wasn't conveyed verbally, the preciousness of the elements of the body and the blood were conveyed just by gestures and all sorts of things.
The
that
kneeling,
inside
you were in a
not receiving the
humble position,
the host in your hand, etc. So we've had 2, maybe even 3 generations now that have not really been seriously introduced, either theoretically or by the way that the sacrament has been practiced. So in a lot of ways, this is not a surprise. But I'll say this, I have a feeling that those who are going to be left in the church in the coming years are going to be the ones who believe in the real presence.
Yeah, Father Murray, among regular churchgoers who attend Mass weekly or more, only 63% believe that this is actually the body and blood of Jesus in the consecrated host.
So I have 2 comments on that, Raymond. The first has to do with catechetical instruction or Christian doctrine being taught either in CCD or schools. I don't believe the transubstantiation is taught to the degree and extent it needs to be. On the second comment, it would be, this is the result of the liturgical chaos in the church that we've experienced since the new Mass came in. The proposal at Vatican II was to make the Mass more accessible, and that meant, of course, making the doctrine concerning what the Mass is more accessible. But we've had the exact opposite. And I remember as a child, I received my first communion kneeling on the tongue. The Mass was in Latin. There was solemnity around it. Now what do we have? We have a free-for-all in the sanctuary. We have the casual distribution of Holy Communion. People don't kneel. In fact, some priests get annoyed if people kneel.
Right.
And, the doctrine is taught not simply by what teachers and catechists say, but how the priests and the liturgy communicates the message. And quite frankly, as a priest, it's one of the saddest things for me to be distributing Holy Communion to people and to see that there's no apparent sign of reverence in what they're doing. It's sort of habitualistic ritual. We need to restore, through liturgical order, whether it be the extraordinary form or the new Mass, liturgical order showing that indeed this is the body and blood of Christ. The very same Christ who walked the earth is sacramentally present. We should never treat him casually, because that can lead to a loss of faith.
Well, I have to say, when I saw this study, this Pew survey, my first thought was, this is why everything we report here each week, all the things we discuss, this is why it matters. Because when you pull apart the theology and then you disrupt the practice, whether it be of marriage or family life or the liturgy, this stuff has consequences. And you are separating individuals, souls, from truth and possibly salvation in the doing. And I mean, this shows you the depth of this. And I just think it's a shameful report to read this. And when you realize under the age of 40, only 26% of people believe. These are among churchgoers. 26% believe in the actual presence of the host. In high school or less, 26%. That means 74% don't believe in this or haven't been taught the doctrine. Bob.
When my oldest daughter was at a very good Catholic school over in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river here, she came into my office at home one Saturday morning, and I used to have those big 2 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary, and she said to me, she was 6 years old, she said, "Dad, if I looked up transubstantiation, would it be in there?" And I said, that's why I don't mind paying the tuition at a Catholic school.
That was the right question.
That was a real Catholic school.
She asked the right question. Final topic, gents. G.K. Chesterton's cause was shut down last week over worries of anti-Semitism. A bishop in England said, the local bishop handling the cause said he's concerned about anti-Semitic writings and a lack of a local cult. Your quick reaction, Father Jerry.
Well, I'm a big Chesterton fan, but I'll have to say I never considered him to be a saint, meaning a man of extraordinary sanctity. I certainly think he was a very effective teacher. He's one of the best Christian apologists we've ever had. So I'm a little bit hesitant that we have to, canonize every not successful Catholic, but every Catholic who's had success in promoting the mission of the Church, because some of them are just ordinary people with graces. Now, about the anti-Semitism thing, I think that's unfair, because Chesterton was not an anti-Semite. He was definitely against the persecution of the Jews. If you want to discuss his writings, that's something to be done. But certainly the impression that he had anything, of a philo-Nazi or anti-Semitic approach back in the 30s, that's ridiculous. He was not like that.
Bob Royal.
Yeah, I would just add this. The bishop also said that he didn't notice sort of a concrete spirituality to Chesterton. I actually think there is. I mean, I love Chesterton too, of course, and I don't know if he ought to be declared a saint or not. But it would be an unusual saintliness that we would have to look at, that drinking beer and eating nice steaks and smoking cigars and having fun in God's creation and being appreciative of God's creation. There may be room for that type of saint somewhere in the modern world.
The saint of leisure and pubs. I could buy that. I could buy that. And the written word. Writers need all the help we can get, so I'm not going to discount anybody. Father Jerry Murray, Robert Royal, thank you so much for being here. As always, your mutual commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org and right here on the Papal Posse. Thank you both.